In May 1945, Germany lay at the center of a contradiction that no propaganda ministry could edit. For 12 years, it had claimed to be a modern state built on speed, order, and industrial power. And yet the war ended with that same state reduced to improvised survival, its railways broken, its factories silent, its cities stripped down to brick dust and twisted rebar, its government dissolved into surrender documents and occupation orders. The weapons that once defined German power were still everywhere. But now they were inert objects, tanks with empty fuel lines, aircraft without spare parts, naval guns pointing at nothing, warehouses of ammunition guarded by foreign soldiers. The Reich had demanded discipline and total mobilization. What remained was a population mobilized only by hunger, cold, and the need to find a bed that still had a roof above it. Berlin, once the nerve center of a continental war, was now a landscape of partial walls and scorched corridors. After the war ended on 8th of May 1945, the city had suffered the destruction of 600,000 apartments, and its population had fallen from about 4.3 million to about 2.8 million, still living there, surrounded by rubble that could not be cleared quickly enough to make streets fully usable again. The capital was divided into 4 sectors under the occupation powers, an administrative solution that looked clean on a map, but felt like a fracture line in daily life. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The end of the fighting did not end the machinery that had driven it. It simply changed what the machinery was used for. The Allied armies that entered Germany in 1945 did not arrive to negotiate with a state still functioning. They arrived to administer a collapse. The most immediate problem was physical. Roads were cratered, bridges were down or damaged, rail yards were shattered. Coal mines and power stations could not reliably feed electricity into cities that had lost their water systems, their gas networks, and in many cases the actual buildings those systems served. In the British zone of occupation, the conditions were not the aftermath of a normal defeat. They were the conditions of a continent-scale system failing all at once. British commanders faced German prisoners of war by the million, wounded soldiers, civilians displaced by the fighting, former forced laborers from across Europe, and refugees moving in every direction as if the borders themselves had become fluid. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery later summarized the scale of what confronted the occupation authorities. Masses of POWs, refugees, broken transport, stalled industry and agriculture, shortages of food, and the risk of starvation and epidemics, problems that had to be handled quickly, even by leaders trained for combat, not governance. Across Germany, the damage was not just symbolic, it was measurable in housing stock and habitable space. In Cologne, observers reported that roughly 66% of houses were destroyed. In Dusseldorf, reports described 93% as uninhabitable. These were not statistics from a distant report, they were the arithmetic of shelter, how many rooms remained, how many walls still held, how many staircases could carry a bucket of water to an upper floor that still existed. The Allied occupation was planned on paper long before the war ended. It was built on conference tables and staff studies on the assumption that Germany could be controlled through directives and administrative structures. But the Germany the Allies occupied was not an intact machine waiting for new orders. It was a wrecked system whose components still existed but no longer connected. Factories without raw materials, cities without transport, farms without fuel, families without homes, and a currency that could not reliably translate labor into food. In the immediate post-war economy, the Reichsmark existed, but value did not. Goods did, calories did, coal did, cigarettes did. The result was a black market that filled the vacuum where normal commerce had collapsed, turning small portable items into practical money. In Berlin, by the summer of 1945, large black markets operated openly in places like the Tiergarten and Alexanderplatz, where civilians, demobilized soldiers, displaced persons, and Allied troops circulated in a barter economy that treated cigarettes, chocolate, liquor, and watches as exchangeable units of survival. This was not only a German phenomenon, it was a feature of occupation. Allied soldiers carried access to rationed supplies, PX goods, mess items, military stores that could be converted into local currency or traded directly. The gap between official exchange rates and real purchasing power turned the occupation zones into systems of friction and leakage, where control was asserted by patrols and regulations, but undermined by the physics of scarcity. The black market became, in practice, a parallel logistics network, and like any logistics network, it followed predictable rules. It moved what was scarce to where it was desired, and it rewarded those who could obtain, transport, and protect it. At Potsdam, from 17th July to 2nd August 1945, the Allied leaders confirmed the broad shape of what Germany would become in the immediate post-war world, a demilitarized, disarmed country under 4 zones of occupation. German military and paramilitary forces were to be eliminated, and industries that could support renewed war were to be dismantled or forbidden from producing military hardware. The occupation was not only a security project, it was an attempt to reshape German society by removing Nazi structures and encouraging democratic political life at local and regional levels, even while the reconstitution of a national German government was postponed indefinitely. The decisions at Potsdam also collided with a human reality already in motion. As the borders shifted and the Soviet-Polish-German territorial arrangement changed, the forced movement of populations accelerated. Millions of Germans were expelled or fled from territories in the east, and the Allies at Potsdam recognized that transfers were occurring and insisted, at least in formal language, that they should be orderly and humane, even as they worried that an uncontrolled influx could destabilize the Western occupation zones. In practice, the movement of people into a ruined Germany meant that cities with shattered housing and weak food supply now had to absorb additional populations with no immediate capacity to build. To understand what Germany looked like right after the war, it helps to think in materials rather than slogans. The war had converted cities into industrial debris fields. Rubble was not just an image, it was a substance that blocked streets, buried water lines, filled basements, and turned every reconstruction task into a demolition problem first. In Berlin, the destruction was so total that daily life became a process of navigating voids, walking routes that existed only because the debris had been shifted enough to form a path, living in rooms that were still technically indoors because a ceiling remained somewhere above. The occupation zones were not abstract. They shaped the experience of recovery. Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and France each ran their zones with their own priorities and administrative styles, even though an Allied Control Council existed in Berlin as a mechanism for joint governance. In reality, the first years were marked by uneven policies and rising disagreements over reparations, economic planning, and the political future of Germany itself. The British Zone, administered through military government and the Control Commission Germany, confronted severe shortages of food and fuel and a housing crisis, worsened by the need to billet occupation forces. By late 1945, the British Army of the Rhine and associated occupation structures were managing a devastated region while also trying to prevent disease, restore transport, and restart basic industrial output. Food was the baseline pressure that turned a defeated country into a day-by-day endurance test. In the British Zone, rations dropped as low as near starvation levels, reported at 1,000 calories a day in March 1946, before slowly improving and not exceeding 1,500 calories until 1948-49. This mattered because calories were not an abstraction either. They were the difference between being able to perform heavy labor and being forced to spend hours searching for supplemental food in rural areas, which in turn reduced industrial productivity and delayed recovery. A defeated nation still needed an energy budget. Without it, coal could not be mined efficiently, railways could not be repaired quickly, and factories could not reach even minimal output. And yet, even within this collapse, the outlines of the next world were already visible. The occupation was not only dismantling German war capacity, it was also competing over German knowledge and technology. German industrial assets, patents, and specialized expertise became objects of Allied extraction. The logic was consistent with wartime logic: deny capabilities to a future enemy and acquire what could accelerate your own programs. What had been built under the pressure of total war, jet aircraft, rockets, advanced optics, chemical processes, did not vanish with surrender. It became inventory. Meanwhile, the practical work of rebuilding began at ground level, often without the drama of formal conferences. It meant restoring transport infrastructure, reopening schools, organizing local councils, creating order where central authority had ceased. The British occupation authorities described their early approach as first things first, a sequence driven by sanitation, food supply, transport, and basic governance. Montgomery even described the occupation effort as a battle of the winter, a phrase that captured how quickly the war's front lines were replaced by a different kind of operational urgency: coal deliveries, housing allocation, rations, and disease prevention. Germany right after World War II was therefore not a single picture. It was a system of simultaneous endings and beginnings. The symbols of the Nazi state were being removed, banned, or dismantled. Military structures were dissolved, war criminals were being hunted and prosecuted, even as political will for extended prosecutions would later weaken. The economy was frozen by the absence of functioning currency and the shortage of food and raw materials. Yet the same occupation forces responsible for dismantling Germany were also laying groundwork for long-term stability, restoring law, re-establishing local government, and eventually preparing the conditions in which recovery could become possible. In Berlin, this contradiction was visible in every frame of surviving footage: rubble-filled streets, damaged landmarks, civilians moving through ruins, while occupation forces imposed a new administrative geometry on a city that had been physically shattered. The war ended. The smoke did not immediately clear, and Germany's next chapter began not with speeches, but with logistics: coal, bread, rail ties, bricks, and the slow conversion of wreckage back into shelter. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.